we've got some resolutions issues here on the big screen because of my Mac habit. Over there provides a little bit better view at times, I think, and I think this will work for our purposes. So I'm going to talk to you about work that we're doing in the Judith River Basin. A number of you in the room have seen pieces of this before. I presented some of it at AWRA this past fall, as did Adam Sigler, who's a PhD student with me and also an MSU Extension employee. Christine Miller is a master's student with me. Andrew John is a master's student with Clayton Jones. And Michael Bestwick is now a master's student with Chengxi Cheng at the Central Ag Research Center. Faculty at MSU involved are Clayton Jones, Jack Brookshire, and Robert Payne, with a little help from Glenn Shaw from time to time. Doug Jackson-Smith at Utah State is our sociologist on the project, and there's a big participatory element to this that I'm not going to talk about a lot today, but tune in. I think the nitrate conference is coming up in April. Will be a place where Adam holds forth on that topic. It's been a pretty important part of this work. And then I'll show some isotope data recently acquired with working with Scott Wonkull at Woods Hole. Hi, Chris. Not working. It was working.
There's another one. See, there's a white. See, Kathy, it's behind the tablet. Okay, and that one is the same deal. It's got forward and backward.
But it's got the kill button.
And I don't know which one is the kill button. But there's the laser. You just need these two. And that should, you have to hold it down for a second for it to laze. No? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then advancing. And then
just those two. No?
It's stuck.
Not even.
Can do it with that. Yeah, all right. Really? Yeah. Okay. It almost worked. It's probably that high-res thing, right, Colleen? Anyway, I'm starting off here with the soil profile because that's what I do, but to me the implications are strong here in reading this profile for a bit of a story about water. So we'll get back to that as the talk proceeds. So the issue at hand is nitrate in groundwater. In our case, shallow aquifers in the Judith Basin, but this is not an uncommon problem. High nitrate in groundwater is ubiquitous, tends to occur in agricultural areas where we have large inputs of nitrogen with fertilizer application at the surface. Pardon me while I try to get comfortable here. So these figures from Bureau et al. Show inputs in color shades of green, high numbers in the red symbols, and a lack of data in this network, which is the USGS network for Montana. Weird. Okay. All right, so here we are in the Judith River Basin. This was some of the motivational data that launched us on this project.
We can move this.
Oh, we can move this.
So that you can at least see what you're to a certain extent. How's that?
Awesome. We've arranged this figure in the configuration that shows us what was of interest to us when we started this study. So what you're looking at is in the grays, and I guess I can point with this, or maybe I should. Strath terraces and alluvial fans that form the areas largely cultivated in the Judith Basin. The dark symbols are, this is all GWIC data, thank you guys very much, showing high nitrate levels that tend to correspond with these level landforms that are cultivated. What's underlying, so the gray is quaternary or maybe quaternary tertiary gravel deposits that overlie Cretaceous age shales. The familiar assortment, those shales perch at the shallow water tables that are of interest here. And so it was this observation of chronic high nitrate in this area that led us to undertake this work. Oh, brutal. So we focused our efforts, this is a big area, we focused our efforts on characteristic landforms. So, a strath terrace that is more connected to the mountains here, an isolated strath terrace that I'll focus on today near Moccasin, and an alluvial fan near Moore, Montana that also is connected to mountain runoff. And so, I don't know if I explained, get a little distracted, sorry. The red symbols are nitrate in groundwater, and the darkest blue is above the drinking water limit of 10 ppm. There are a couple of things to point out about agriculture in this area that is important to understanding nitrate dynamics. It is a situation of dryland wheat production, consistent with 99% of the northern Great Plains, or 99% of agriculture in the northern Great Plains. Livestock in between areas where the soils aren't as good. Common fallowing, the practice of having a year without a crop as part of a 3-year rotation for producing wheat. And as I said, shallow and confined aquifers, well-drained soils because of the gravel mantle that overlies the shale, but fertile soils because those gravels are in turn mantled with loess, likely dating to the presence of the ice sheet that allows for long-term development of fertile soils. Little best management practice adoption in this area. So this was an area of interest to people with the NRCS, for example, who would like to get people to work to improve the situation with nitrate levels. So we ask, how has land use influenced groundwater nitrate in this region over time? Specifically agriculture, how can we manage that effect sustainably given intimate association of land use with local communities? So as I said, there's a very deliberate participatory element of this because we'd like it to be effective. We'd like to have producers in the area get involved with how we address this chronic problem of high nitrate. Okay, so this is data from a monitoring well at the center of the basin. I don't want to go back, I'm scared. Here it is. It's the M1 well. I'll refer to it a lot on the Moccasin Terrace. And this record, again, is courtesy of GWIC and the Montana Department of Agriculture. This was motivational data for our study. So what you're looking at is nitrate as milligrams per liter over the time period between 1994 and more or less the present. I don't have all our numbers on there. And the red symbols, so the blue symbols are the GWIC data. The red symbols are the work of Christine Miller as a master's student for me, sampling streams and groundwater in 2012. Here we're just showing the M1 data. So consistent with the long-term trend, a doubling of nitrate concentrations in this well over that time period. Okay, so we can think about what's been going on with sources of nitrate in this area by looking at, oh, a completely discombobulated record. What is this gibberish? God, I totally don't get this graph. If you were looking at, if if you're looking at this figure, you would see that it goes from approximately 1920 to the present on the horizontal axis. And on the vertical axis, it goes from 0 to about 100 kilograms per hectare nitrogen. The green symbols, this forces me to explain it better, right? It's actually better. The green symbols are wheat yield as nitrogen. So we've seen steady increases in our wheat yield in Montana over this time period. The brown symbols are fertilizer applications. So you can't tell, but right around 1960, we figured out how to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. And so that trend of increase from 0 starts at that point. We figured out how to fix it and make industrial fertilizer, and at the same time meet the need that was being recognized that you could increase your yields by applying nitrogen. So the story here really is that there's a gap between fertilizer applied and what's grown in the crop that represents an internal production of nitrate, or at least bioavailable nitrogen that the crop uses. Now we're up at a point where we're applying as much or more fertilizer than what we take off in yield. So it's hard to tell about the internal cycling. But here you clearly see that soils are providing some nutrients to these plants. Maybe not too surprising in general, but pretty important for the nitrogen story. Okay, so this is a bit of an overview about the project. There's the basin. Now north is down. Showing our 3 landforms to give you some perspective on how we're thinking about them. And the yellows now are those quaternary tertiary gravel deposits. So we're testing effects of management changes, and that's what's represented on the bottom here. In fields on the 3 landforms, A, B, and C, as they're noted here, A, Stanford, B, Moccasin, C, Moore, we're looking at management effects along boundaries in fields growing wheat. So this is working with participants who are actively engaged in this research. This is a great group of producers that we're sharing results with and engaging in a conversation about how we think about this system and nitrate dynamics in this system and what's realistic to do in terms of improving the situation and not doing away with, agriculture as we know it, particularly large-scale agriculture. These guys are locals who've typically been there all their lives, but, a couple will farm 5,000 acres. So there's just some logistics involved in that I did not appreciate as much as I do now. What's shown here on boundaries that we're comparing are soil coring and biomass sampling locations. I just want to draw your attention to the black squares, which are soil pit locations. The participatory part of this project is really courtesy of Doug Jackson Smith at Utah State. He designed, sort of laid out in the proposal how we were going to undertake this, and it's worked very well. So we have a couple of participant groups that we work with. We're evaluating field and landscape scale hydrology in addition to doing this field scale boundary testing, more of an agronomic approach. So larger scale hydrology plus the agronomic management part of the picture. And here's the concept I kind of touched upon earlier, just that the Moccasin terrace is isolated from mountain parent recharge, so water is diverted around and mainly comes into the shallow aquifer by dispersed recharge on the surface of the terrace. Stanford and also Moore, by contrast, have more of a connection. And so we can exploit this at examining dynamics on the Moccasin terrace to inform the parts of this story that have to do with the influence of land use on water quality. Okay, so I'm going to talk a fair amount about soils here in the next few slides. What can we learn about nitrate supply to groundwater by looking at soil nitrate and soil moisture in the context of management? So we have shallow gravel contacts in these soils, often shallow water tables. We have cropping systems that have changed over time, very little residual native vegetation, and then seasonal effects that are important that I'll touch upon. In addition, we can think more explicitly about soil hydrology in mediating the movement, the physical transport of nitrate to shallow aquifers, in addition to facilitating some of the biological processes. Part 2, I'll talk about groundwater and surface water. What do groundwater and surface water chemistry tell us about the origin and fate of nitrate in this context? So we'll look at some data for concentration of nitrate in other solutes, and I'll show you some recent data for isotopic indicators of water and nitrate dynamics. Okay, so soil sampling. We did a lot of soil sampling, actually a lot more than we'd planned, because we realized we wanted to understand about these shallow gravel contacts, go a little bit deeper than you would in a traditional agronomic study. So we undertook on those boundary locations that I showed you a moment ago, 4 paired locations per boundary on 8 boundaries, volumetric sampling, 15 centimeter increments with depth. And again, these soils are loess over alluvial gravels. The gravel contact is typically 40 to 110 centimeters in depth. When we had pits open, we installed lysimeters and moisture arrays so that we could track the movement of water and sample some of it as we went along. So here's one of those excavations. Adam got very good with the mini excavator at making perfect 1 by 2 meter by 1.49 meter pits. There he is. This was our soils crew, not just Adam, but Kyle Marins, now working for the city of Bozeman, and Mike Bestwick, grad student at MSU, were pivotal to making this happen. So installing instrumentation. These are suction lysimeters made by Prenart, and moisture sensors from Onset, kind of the low budget option, but it adds up quickly with a lot of locations. So here's how one of those soil profiles looks. I've been talking about gravel contacts, but they're often not that clear. I placed this one right about here. And what is hard to see in the photograph is that there's an accumulation of clay above it that tends to hold up water in solutes. So that would be the critical part for the hydrologic story. Okay, so I'm going to show you a series of figures here that looks at some of the soil profile results, nitrate concentrations with depth. So there's going to be several that look like this. This is kilograms nitrate per hectare with depth in the 5 of the 8 profiles along this boundary. So the dotted and the solid here just indicate either side of the boundary. These are both fallow locations in 2012, so they've had no plants on them. And what you see is this characteristic distribution with depth, an exponential decrease with depth, which is what you would expect from mineralization of organic matter. There's a lot more organic matter than nitrate in the soil, and some of it goes to transform into this kind of a distribution. But these bulges are important, and they tend to occur in that clay rich zone above the gravel contact. So we get variation in nitrate inventory. We can add all this up. So this is volumetric sampling, kilograms nitrate-N per hectare. We've gotten the concentration for the soil and calculated this from bulk density. And we've done it for a number of profiles that vary in their gravel depth. What we see is a pretty big range, 40 to 80 kilograms nitrate-N per hectare in this fallow situation. So some characteristic shapes are this mineralization curve. I'll show you in a second. When we have weed uptake, that is taken all the way down. When we have some leaching go on, we might take this curve and move it downward in the soil profile where it might get hung up in that clay-rich zone and be kind of poised for leaching when the profile fills up. This one is a comparison between peas in rotation. That's one of our treatments instead of fallow. So peas are shallow rooted. They take the nitrate out of the top part of the profile. So the solid lines are the peas, the dotteds are the fallow. We see a doubling, well, a halving of the total inventory of nitrate in the profile when when peas are present. So they draw down the shallower nitrate without taking up all the nitrate that's there, leaving some for the next year's crop. An important point if you're thinking about wheat yields later on. With a cereal, this is barley, so the common rotation here has a spring grain in the third year, and that's what we sampled in 2012, all drawn down because cereals root deeply in the profile, and they take the inventory down to about 15 kilograms per hectare. So we see a nice illustration of the effect of plant root architecture on nitrate profiles here. So overall, we have inventories of something like 60 kilograms per hectare in the fallow, half as much in the peas, and still less in the barley. Okay, and this is just a quick plot. It's a little bit cryptic, and the units are a little different. We're always struggling with English units versus metric in terms of talking to people about nitrogen dynamics, talking to locals specifically. So this is in pounds per acre. You multiply by about 1.2 to get to kilograms per hectare. This is with date, and this is looking at 2 fallow situations, and then 2 fields with peas, and the field with barley. And all this is showing you is that over the growing season, the fallow is producing nitrate by mineralization. It's probably going on with the peas too, but they're taking it up so we don't see it. So we can look at the nitrogen in the peas, but we have to look at this curve to see what's disappeared in terms of mineralization, and the barley is lower still. Okay, so one question about these bulges might be, how long have they been there? They can be a substantial part of the inventory in a soil profile, hung up in this clay layer. Do they get hung up there for multiple years at a time? Is this nitrate that gets leached annually? This is a test of that, and it looks like it gets leached annually. So this is 2012 fallow in this profile, and here's the 2013 winter wheat. So the winter wheat has drawn, I suppose I shouldn't conclude leaching, but the winter wheat has drawn down an amount of nitrate that includes both what was left here from the fallow and the 100 kilograms per hectare that was applied by the grower when or in the spring of 2013. And so whether it was taken up by the wheat or leached out of the profile, we can at least argue that the bulges are transient. If we look at a native range site, and we have a nice one that's paired just across the way from some of the profiles I've been showing you, we see in August a very low inventory of 7 kilograms per hectare and a pretty different looking soil profile with a lot of calcium carbonate in it, a thicker organic horizon, a nice integrated organic mat. You can imagine that the hydrology of the soil is quite different than what the cultivated would have been. And although we're sampling in August, I would argue that this water-efficient native plant community is the most efficient example of root activity that we have so far. This was something that the growers were curious about. The sort of the conventional wisdom was we've always had high nitrate in the Judith Basin. It isn't just a function of agriculture. You can't just blame fertilizer, right? So they wanted to know what you would see if you looked at a native soil profile. And so this is addressing directly that query, although sampling with time, I think, is in order here. We did a little bit of sampling with time in the spring in this native cultivated pair, and this shows the results of that work. So this is work by an undergrad funded through the Institute on Ecosystems, working with me, Katie Noland, and she looked at 3 of our locations that were cultivated and 3 adjacent that were uncultivated. This CN is the location I just showed you. This is total inorganic nitrogen to 30 centimeters. So she was just using a push corer. It's hard to get out there, expensive to get out there, and kind of destructive to get out there with an excavator all the time. So we just wanted to do a little time series work. This is just the top 30 centimeters. So in the cultivated, you see this big spike of inorganic N in May. So 3 dates, May, 16 May, 4 June, 18 June in the colors. Fertilizer was applied here in early May. It's not surprising that inorganic nitrogen is really high in those plots. But what's striking is how quickly it goes away. It's gone within a couple of weeks. Now, this is the top 30 centimeters, so we don't know how far it went. We can't conclude that it made it to the water table, but it's a fair amount, 30 to 70 kilograms of inorganic nitrogen loss. And in our uncultivated pairs, we, of course, don't have that kind of springtime spike, except here where maybe Dave Wichman at the Central Ag Research Center did put some fertilizer on this plot, as it turns out. Okay, so I showed you effect of plant communities, and I've talked a little bit about the depth to gravel effect. How strong is it? Well, it's not super strong. This is depth to gravel in our pits. The three colors are our three locations, our three landform locations. Total nitrogen in the pit. There's a weak correspondence to gravel depth. Obviously, some other things going on. It's important to note that gravel depth is also going to influence water storage, and so it's sure to be a player, and part of our task is to figure out to what degree that's true. Okay, I want to just mention a couple other things about these soil profiles because I think it's interesting and I've got a captive audience. One is that if we look at the nitrate here in the purple line as kilograms N per hectare, and we compare it to the total nitrogen, which I'm showing here as megagrams per hectare, right? So you see that where we have 46 kilograms total of nitrate-N per hectare, we have 10,000 of total nitrogen. There's a big pool of organic matter that we make nitrate from in soils. In conjunction with this, we have a lot of organic carbon present, but we have even more inorganic carbon. And so it's important to say that the inorganic carbon inventory is actually bigger than the organic carbon inventory in these profiles, and really is a record of hydrologic legacy over longer timescales, probably the lifetime of soil development. And so just to superimpose that momentarily on our soil profile, that clay-rich horizon is where everything gets held up in terms of solute movement. So we might argue that native organic matter continues to supply nitrogen for agriculture. Even though we're applying fertilizer at the rates we're taking off in yields, we are still, we began by exploiting that nitrogen supply, and we may still be doing it today. There's a mixing process that's going on there. Also, we can see a record of longer-term water balance in the large soil, inorganic carbon inventories in these soil profiles. Okay, so I have no idea what time it is. Can someone tell me? Oh, there's a clock on the wall. Look at that. It's fast. Good. Okay, so thinking about what we've learned in terms of nitrogen dynamics in the sense of a traditional nitrogen cycle. We have inputs and losses in terms of fertilizer and crop yield. And then we have nitrate development or accumulation in the soil profile by several means. And what we'd like to know is how much of that is making it out of soils and into shallow water tables. So we know something about these numbers, and we can make a guess at leaching rates just based on that. So we know we're applying about 100 kilograms per hectare of fertilizer. We're taking off about 95 in crops. So these are just approximate numbers to give you a feel. We're probably losing 6 to volatilization. Rick Engel's work has shown this in the Denison area. But we also have a very large pool of soil organic matter that is contributing mineralized N. We can estimate from some of our time series work 90 kilograms per hectare. So the total pool of nitrate, total inputs to the nitrate pool are 184 kilograms per hectare, even though what we put on in fertilizer was just 100. If we think about what gets taken up by the crop, we can estimate that, and I'm just doing this based on yield and a percentage of root biomass that's left in the soil when you harvest. So you're leaving some organic matter in the soil when you harvest the crop. you're taking off 95, but you're leaving perhaps 56. And so you're contributing to that organic matter pool. But we would argue it appears from what we've measured so far that you're mineralizing more, and therefore, by difference, we can calculate that we're leaching 33 kilograms per hectare in this example. So important to note that inputs to soil nitrate combine fertilizer and soil organic matter. We can think about the losses relative to the fertilizer applied, 33%, but relative to total inputs, it's 18%. And I just say that because a lot of the literature talks about leaching, and it's hard to assess what they're talking about. If you say 33% of your fertilizer is leached, that's probably a smaller percentage of the total inputs that were available for leaching in the soil profile. So when we're thinking about modeling this, this becomes an important question. Okay, so a little bit of a summary. Nitrate in soils becomes available for leaching through both of those processes I mentioned, mineralization of organic matter and fertilizer application. So by virtue of the act of cultivation in the first place, breaking ground, it's well known locally that you release nitrogen when you do that, and that's because you're physically disturbing that organic horizon at the surface of the soil, making it available for decomposition. But it's also true that at the same time, you're making it more possible for water to move through the soil profile. So you're really doing two things. And this is very important. There's I think of some work by Bridget Scanlon on the High Plains in Texas, who really showed that with cultivation, you can take a rangeland soil from no recharge of shallow aquifers to, 50 millimeters a year, just by virtue of the act of cultivation and physically breaking up that native plant community and then removing it for a good part of the year. So important point about what makes leaching possible. Shallow gravel contacts reduce nitrogen storage and perhaps make these soils more vulnerable to leaching. Crops take up nitrate once plants are mature. The native communities are more efficient. And what I mean is that we have that a leaching susceptible period early in the crop growth cycle. Mobilization of soil nitrate seems to occur in winter spring. You can infer this from some of those overwinter time series values for nitrate, but it really helps to do a water balance. So that's what I would like to think about next. How does that interact with these soil nitrate dynamics we've been discussing? Because you can do the math and say we must have lost 33 kilograms per hectare, but if you want to argue for how, you have to talk about the water, right? So coupling nitrate with water. How is nitrate physically leached under different conditions of water balance and management? So we can think about this simplistically, and this is something that Adam has really been pushing on lately. We can think about our soil moisture pool as that packet of fines above the gravel contact. Maybe it's 60 centimeters thick. We know how much water that's going to store, and we know how much rainfall it takes, balanced by ET, to move water through that profile. And so we can calculate what we expect what he's calling deep percolation to be. That is the movement of water below the soil profile. So we start with rainfall, and this is Moccasin agromat data. We can use, so we've worked a lot with soil moisture data from the Moccasin scan site, the NRCS site, where there's an instrumented soil profile. You can download data going back to 2006, I believe, in this case. These are interesting sites, interesting data to use that couple atmospheric measurements with soil moisture information. And we can also look at ET. This is in the traditional approach. I'll show you some other data for ET in a second. So we can think about these periods where increased precipitation increases soil moisture beyond its capacity for storage and beyond the loss to ET, resulting in leaching. So here's how that goes. We're thinking specifically about a soil profile above a gravel contact and a packet of fines that is well mixed and homogeneous for purposes of this exercise. There's pore space there that must become water-filled before percolation can occur. And here's how that goes. We know that we have bounds on this situation between field capacity, which is the maximum amount of water that the soil can hold. So the vertical axis here is volumetric water, and we're looking at, we're going to look at data through time. But that upper boundary is saturation. Wilting point is the amount of water held by the soil against gravity. So that is water that will not be released under gravity and cannot be percolated downward. So these are boundaries on this thinking. We can look at a model of water content using the approach I described in the previous slide that makes a prediction about the water content in the soil based on the precip and ET information. And when we pass that field capacity threshold, we can come up with a, whoops, incorrect pointing, come up with a rate of deep percolation that reflects sort of the overflow of the soil profile for whatever thickness we've designated. So we're modeling a deep percolation here just based on that simple concept of how the soil profile stores water. Here's the real scan data for 8 inches with a pasture approach for ET. And we find that we come pretty close. There's some important exceptions here in terms of fall water balance, but we're getting somewhere. And importantly, we can look, the scan sites have soil moisture at a couple of depths. So this lower boundary now is field capacity of gravels. We know this 40-inch sensor on the scan site is within gravels in this particular profile. And so we see that the moisture there is recording what we would interpret as deep percolation as well. Okay, and then we can get a little bit fancier with this using some additional data, and we can couple it with nitrate numbers. So what this is now is precip over the course of the year. In collaboration with Paul Stoy at Montana State, we put in a tower, an eddy covariance or eddy flux tower at our C location. And so these are ET data that pertain to that location, which is in winter wheat in 2013 and this year. So this is a balance for winter wheat. Comparing potential ET from alfalfa, we can see some important differences there. Presumably this should be real with a caveat that this is a flux tower and there's some qualifications there. But in general, we can use our eddy flux data to then model volumetric moisture coupled with the precip, come up with a deep percolation number, and then use what we know about evolution of nitrate in the soil profile to come up with a rate of nitrate leaching. So this is just thinking about the soil as a well-mixed box where nitrate is leached in proportion to what's there and what's percolated. So the proportion of water percolated in this simple model is the amount of, corresponds to the proportion of nitrate that is there that is leached, if that makes sense. So we find that leaching primarily occurs in spring because ET is low, precip is high, and we don't have, and ET is low because, specifically because the plants are not mature at this time. So we can calculate that we have 100 to 200 millimeters of water leaching in spring, and this is based on varying the depth of the gravel contact over reasonable bounds. So if we vary the thickness of that packet of fines, we get more or less leaching accordingly. For nitrate, a little hard to see, but we get 40 to 60 kilograms of nitrate-N per hectare when we do this exercise. So that's very dependent on our understanding of how nitrate arrives in the soil profile, how mineralization occurs, how those processes that I've been describing in the previous section add up to a concentration of nitrate at a given time. It'd be really great if we had a sensor that could continuously measure nitrate in the soil profile, because it's a big question mark. How much shows up from mineralization? How does it move around? one next step might be to think about how those bulges in nitrate come to be, how nitrate is moved around locally in the soil profile and primed for leaching. So this takes that was daily time step modeling. This takes that daily time step effort and considers it at a monthly time step. And we did this because we were wanting to think about the cumulative effects of rotation on leaching dynamics. So what this figure shows is precip, so it's connecting the dots on the precip points here. Precip at the top, nitrogen in the middle, and deep perk at the bottom. The nitrogen is broken into nitrate in the soil in the dark blue, nitrate taken up by the crop in the green, and then nitrate leached out the bottom in the red, obviously coincident with when the deep percolation happens. But we have to have nitrate there to be able to leach anything, so there has to be coincident timing there. There are some issues with this plot. I would say it's in development stage, but this was a very effective figure for talking to producers about how you might have in a big water year more leaching and more deep percolation, but you see leaching curtailed by the sequence of spring grain, peas, winter grain. We can compare that to the same kind of representation for a cycle with fallow instead of peas. And what we see is that the fallow contributes to accumulation of nitrate in the soil profile. This isn't really surprising. That's part of the purpose of fallow. But what this figure does is to illustrate how that accumulation makes you vulnerable to leaching the following spring or in the following winter-spring period. So you have more leaching here because you have a bigger accumulation of nitrate in the profile, and you've also got more deep percolation because you don't have a crop there. You've reduced ET. So some concluding thoughts for that section. Rates of nitrogen mineralization and fertilization still determine when nitrate is available for leaching, even if we are obsessing about the water. Nitrate mobilization tends to occur in winter-spring due to the water balance. And in rotational sequences, it is the storage of water and nitrate that set the stage for leaching. And that storage is enhanced in fallow. As I said, deliberately, it's intended to store water, but that allows you to move water through the soil profile more readily. All right, so is nitrate really making it into groundwater? We've talked a lot about it moving out of the soil, but what evidence do we have that it is arriving in the groundwater? So I mentioned the results of the water balance assessment, and I've expanded the range here a little bit for the recharge rates that we come up with, 50 to 200 millimeters of water per year, based on assessment of the water balance in the Moccasin aquifer. I've mentioned a couple of ranges for nitrate leaching balance. We're in this ballpark, 30 to 50 kilograms nitrate-N per hectare per year. If we look at the Moccasin aquifer, we have this unique situation. As I said, it's cut off from mountain front stream recharge, and so we can think about that perched aquifer as an entire volume for mixing, and think about the nitrogen inventory that's there and what rate of leaching must have happened in order to take it to that level. What we observe on average lately is about 21 parts per million nitrate-N in the aquifer. We can make an estimate of its volume based on well logs and an assumption about the volumetric water content of the aquifer material. We come up with the numbers shown here when we do that. And then we can also look at concentrations in surface water and discharge measurements to make an assessment of the overall residence time of water in the aquifer and the overall export of nitrogen. So I put some ranges on here. This is really a thought exercise for me trying to put all of our numbers together. But we have if we have 6 times 10 to the 6 kilograms of nitrogen in the aquifer and 2 to 6 times 10 to the 8 cubic meters of water, we can look at our discharge records and estimate that we have 1 to 3 times 10 to the 7 cubic meters of water per year leaving the landform. That tells us that our residence time in the aquifer must be decades, 10 to 60 years. It also tells us something about the turnover of nitrogen, but recall that we have increasing inputs. So whereas we might be able to look at the water balance in the aquifer as a steady state situation, we can't do that for the nitrogen. So I would argue, and I'll show you some additional data in support of this, that leaching must supply groundwater, nitrate to groundwater over relatively short timescales. And as I said, the water balance here implies a residence time of 10 to 60 years, which allows for some accumulation of water in the aquifer. It's shallow, it's thin, we can build up a high concentration, especially if we have the 100-year history of cultivation to work with. So then we might ask, I've showed you some surface water numbers here. On average, we see about 10 ppm in surface waters leaving, and the emergent streams leaving the Moccasin aquifer. Does that imply loss? We've got 10 ppm leaving, 21 ppm in shallow wells when we sample the aquifer. What's going on there? So we can go looking for larger scale controls on those dynamics by sampling wells, springs, and surface water locations on the Moccasin terrace. These are emergent streams fed by springs that drain the shallow aquifer. It's really an ideal situation for modeling for kind of naturally occurring boundary conditions for this kind of land use aquifer dynamic situation, or that we'd like to assess. So we expect that the groundwater will accumulate nitrate at rates determined by both nitrate supply and the rate of deep percolation or recharge, as well as groundwater flow and discharge rates. So we can think about groundwater flow through the aquifer, and we can also think about rates of recharge at the surface. And we have this well-bounded problem of, and then of course we can measure discharge of the emergent streams, and we've got a water balance. So if I'm going to show you some data for sampling locations, and we've tried to spread these across this landform with the thinking that loss processes, if they are occurring, should be reflected across sites, or by, in contrast, accumulation processes. So I'm going to show you data for 3 wells: the M1 well, an artesian well deeper in the confined aquifer at Moccasin, and a well known as Mud Springs up gradient. 4 spring locations, and then 3 surface water locations. So I might just point out that I'll show you a lot of data for the Louse Creek. The Louse Creek is this main drainage exiting the landform. Louse Creek upper is always going to be in the green triangles. Louse Creek lower is in the orange triangles. And then I'll have one headwater location, Rock Creek. This is actually at the head of the Morphan, but I'll show you some data points for it, just as an indication of how different that mountain front water tends to look. It should not be a factor at Moccasin. Okay, I'm going to go a little long. I hope you guys can bear with me. Water versus solute dynamics at the M1 well and lower Louse Creek. So this is thinking about the water balance in M1. This is precip record. This panel shows you discharge in the blue lines and depth from the surface of the water table in the well. So you can see that discharge in the spring is tied to rising level of water in the well, differently with the character of the water year. And you can also see this overall decline, which is coming down from 2011, big water year. This one is specific conductivity. So here's the M1 well in the red getting gradually higher. I should point out this is 2 years of data from January 2012 to the end of 2013. Specific conductivity getting higher in M1 a little bit, and bouncing around in response to increases in discharge. So decreasing conductivity with increases in discharge in Louse Creek. But when we look at the nitrate, by comparison, it looks different. M1 well is very consistently at this 20 ppm level. Louse Creek, as I alluded to earlier, is more like 10. So we don't see seasonal variation in the nitrate numbers. You know, maybe I'll characterize that generally as rapid mixing. Okay, so here finally, for Chris Damon's enjoyment, is some water, and maybe Steve too, some water isotope data. So this is thinking about this is thinking about sourcing of water and timing of recharge to the aquifer. So this is plotting O18 in water samples versus delta D, and the line here is the Butte meteoric water line per Gammons et al. 2006. And the blue symbols up here at the top are rainfall samples collected mainly in 2013, a couple in 2012, and mainly during the main part of the growing season. So a bit of variability there that we could talk about. The sampling locations cluster more. So in here we have the 3 wells and the spring locations on the Moccasin terrace, and then down here we have that Rock Creek headwaters location. So consistently lower values in our sampling locations on the Moccasin terrace. And so a suggestion here, so as we come off the line, we know this represents evaporation to some degree. And here's Chris's figure illustrating that relative to the local meteoric water line here. So perhaps these samples coming off the line is a reflection of evaporation process that occurs in soils as water is recharged to the shallow aquifer and comes to these locations. This one just shows the sites a little more without the rainfall so that you can see how they fall out differently from one another. This is M1 in 2 years. 2 years of M1 and 2 years of spring locations, as well as 2013 in that upgradient well location. Falling on the line is the Kark artesian well, so maybe that makes sense. And these are looking like evaporated, but somewhat differently evaporated coming off of the line. Same goes for the Rock Creek samples. Could the fact that all of these values are lower than rainfall, the rainfall samples we collected, be evidence of dominantly springtime infiltration? So here's the time series on the O18 values. And what we're seeing is rainfall at the top, the Porter Spring, so an emergent spring, down gradient at Moccasin, the M1 well, and then that upper Rock Creek headwaters location. And so what was striking to us here is that these values are all consistently lower than rainfall, although the rainfall does bump around a lot, and maybe we can get to the bottom of that a little bit more. Is this an example of springtime rain being having an isotopically lower value along the lines of this? This is the figure showing seasonal trends from Gammons 2006. And so if we're sampling here in our aquifer and sampling here with our rainfall collector, perhaps that explains this difference. Curious to know thoughts on that. Okay. So we can generally say about the relationship between specific conductivity and nitrate shown here that the wells are consistently higher in nitrate, but don't have a consistent trend with specific conductivity, just in a very general way. And with nitrate, we see highest levels in wells, intermediate levels in springs, and lowest levels in surface waters. And what I'm building up to here is some isotope data for the nitrate. So dual isotope results for nitrate samples in 2012 from Moccasin. So this is just looking at 2012. This is just nitrate concentration. The M1 well is pretty consistent at 20. Upper Louse is a little bit lower. Lower Louse is lower than that. So we have a groundwater well going to emergent surface water, downstream surface water getting progressively lower in nitrate concentration. In addition, we have that rock upper headwaters location that has very low nitrate when it comes out of the mountains, but I'm also plotting here an emergent creek on the Moore fan where Rock Creek is located that jumps up to those kinds of levels that we see in M1 after it passes through that landform and picks up nitrate. Okay, so here's N15 results for nitrate at Moccasin. We go from the M1 well to Upper Louse, Lower Louse, and the headwater stream to the emergent creek. I didn't explain well enough. This is nitrate concentration on the x-axis, N15 on the y-axis. If we're losing nitrate with a fractionating effect that is removing the light isotope, we expect to go in this direction where we go down in concentration and we increase our N15 value. And we do that strikingly in the downstream direction, considering the well versus the surface water locations. And I'm sorry, I didn't change my M1 symbols here to squares, but that's still M1. There, they're squares. Trying to make it comprehensible. This is N15 versus O18 in the nitrate. And so I said fractionating loss before because we were just thinking about N15. This looks like a pretty clear symbol of a signal of denitrification as we go from aqueous soil extracts, 4 soils on the Moccasin landform to the M1 well and into surface water. So as we follow that pathway down with the water, we see evidence of denitrification in the change in both isotopes. So we're getting heavier in both isotopes because denitrification favors the loss of the light isotope. It's more or less a one-to-one line, and that is striking because there's some debate about what generates the slope of that line. And it's important to say that this is a big, complicated situation. We probably can't get an isotope effect out of the N15 nitrate relationship except in a sort of aggregate sense where we recognize that we're passing through a heterogeneous medium where, you know, nitrate may be trapped and denitrified in pores, and we don't really see that signal. Okay, so I'm going to finish up with just a little bit, with just the long-term model. I presented this at AWRA. It hasn't really changed, but I think this is where we'd like to go, or the thinking that we'd like to do in terms of the long-term story. So if we think about the Moccasin terrace as a well-mixed box, represented here in blue, that has as its main source of nitrate the soil with the inputs and losses we've discussed, we can look at that on annual time steps and evaluate the change in nitrate concentration over time. And this is thesis work of Christine Miller, who finished in November and has gone on to work for the Gallatin Water Quality Control District. The effort here was to ask, can we get to 20 ppm given what we know about the land use history? So if we look at, and to do this, we have to use those records, that illegible record of wheat yield nitrogen and fertilizer nitrogen that I showed in the first place, recalling that we don't start applying nitrogen until about here. So this goes from 1900 to 2100 and thinks about groundwater nitrate-N in the well-mixed box sense for the Moccasin aquifer. I'm overlaying this with the M1 data. That's really pretty inappropriate because in this model, I'm mixing the whole aquifer, whereas in the well, we're looking at a specific location on the landform. But again, the idea is just to say, can we get to 20 ppm? Prior to application of nitrogen fertilizer, we see the perturbation that leads to leaching. I mean, we've built that in terms of the mass balance in this model. And this is the kind of thing we'd expect, an approach to a steady state. as we, and these are using real numbers, so the line is bumpy, as we start to apply fertilizer, we increase our inputs. And if we keep going on the trend we're on, we just increase on into the future. But that's pretty unrealistic because we're not going to continue to increase our fertilizer inputs if we don't get a yield result. There must be a yield ceiling out there somewhere. If we increase our efficiency by reducing our leaching estimates by 50%, we don't make a lot of difference. But if we cap fertilizer relative to yield, so we say you can only apply 100% of yield, we hold it steady at the current concentration, because we've then capped the inputs, but we haven't stopped the process of leaching that keeps contributing a mixture of nitrate from mineralization and fertilizer to the soil. We would argue that if we put peas in rotation instead of fallow, we might be able to bring the concentration down over a period of decades to something representing steady state under the circumstances of pea production, which is not entirely quantified and clear here. But just as an illustration, if we do reduce that water storage and that nitrate accumulation with fallow by putting on some kind of interim crop that regulates the water and the nitrate without using too much of it, so that we still have a benefit to the subsequent wheat crop, maybe we can head in this direction. So it's interesting to talk to growers about this because many people are really see fallow as the way that they get big yields the next year. And so what conclusion you come to about how you're going to manage this issue has an economic bottom line that you have to explicitly address. And so that's what we're trying to undertake simultaneously as we produce these numbers. So, concluding remarks about groundwater and nitrate. The Moccasin landform really is an ideal location for assessing these connections. Perhaps we can argue the water isotope results are consistent with dominant spring recharge. It would make sense. Nitrate concentrations in wells and surface waters are seasonally invariable but spatially variable. Mixing of the surface supply in the shallow aquifer is what I take from that. Nitrate isotopes indicate that the losses may actually be large, depending on how the water balance plays out there, but they don't outpace the increasing supply. So there's loss to denitrification, but the fact is that we've increased supply, and you've increased inputs. We don't really get away from that. Okay, final remarks. On these level landforms, the nitrate supply to groundwater is a function of the factors I've discussed. There probably still is an influence of native soil fertility on nitrogen dynamics that we continue to take advantage of implicitly or explicitly depending on our understanding of the system. Winter-spring recharge determines groundwater chemistry on this landform, and losses are outpaced by supply. So hopefully I've illustrated how the nitrate concentrations in this aquifer, these shallow aquifers, are a legacy of land use over the last century, starting with the active cultivation, which physically changes the way water moves around on the landscape and the way nitrate becomes available for mobilization. So if we want to see the effects of management changes, we probably have to allow a comparable amount of time, or we at least have to assess that before we go looking for outcomes. Thank you for your patience. John.
Did your input sheet guys give some insight in terms of the nitrogen source of that groundwater with soil, fertilizer?
They're, from memory, and without going back to the slide, they are in the range for